So my paper will focus on Turkey. I will have to read and apologize for that. I just finalized the paper this morning. So what I will do is just present some preliminary thoughts on the Justice and Development parties, the ruling party for the past 20 years in Turkey, on discourses, practices, and generally policies on minorities. My argument is that what they do in the AKP circles is, especially for the past decade, is to securitize a kind of identity and promote a national identity that promotes the Sunni aspect of Turkishness. So in so doing, I will very briefly offer background of Turkey's anti-minority policies and then focus on the AKP for the past 20 years. So let's begin. We will remove the foreigners dominating our market and hand over the Turkish market to Turks. This is how Shukru Saraçoğlu, the Republican People's Party, the Kemalist party, CHP government's prime minister from 1942 to 46, described the anti-minority varlık vergisi, the wealth tax, which was introduced during World War II and categorized the population as Muslim Turk and non-Muslim Turk to classify taxpayers to reduce the influence of the minority communities and hamper further their dominant status in the economy of the country. What is of importance here is that Saraçoğlu's statement comes in direct contravention of the official proclamations of the new government and the adoption of Article 88 in the 1924 Constitution, which stated that the people of Turkey, regardless of their religion and race, are, in terms of citizenship, Turkish, end of quotation, and thus entitled to equal rights. Turkey's first constitution was influenced to an extent by the archaic now, perhaps, Treaty of Lausanne, the previous year, according to which Turkey still bases its minority policies. However, all Turkish governments have persistently recognized only three minority groups: the Armenian Orthodox Christians, the Greek Orthodox Christians, and the Jews. And these not as ethnic, but as religious minorities. Still, as Saraçoğlu's statement shows, state practice has been very different. Turkification policies, a form of cultural assimilation, failed to recognize individual rights, while Turkishness meant, in all actuality, Turkish-speaking peoples of Turkish ethnic origin, thus deviating from the initial civic or territorial conceptualization of Turkish national identity. Turkification policies continued unabated since 1923, and no doubt marked continuity since the consolidation of the Young Turk regime in 1913. And although during the 1920s, any pressure exerted was mostly at a de facto level, since the beginning of the 1930s, the Ankara government started to pass laws in the parliament in an absolutely anti-minority spirit. For instance, the law of 1932, entitled Restricting Certain Professions and Trades to Turkish Citizens Only, restricted the employment of aliens in certain strategic occupations in the country, all of which were carefully listed in detail. As a result of the implementation of this law, nearly 9,000 non-exchange Greeks lost their jobs and soon thereafter migrated to Greece for good. Similarly, in 1942, with the wealth tax that mentioned already. but also after World War II, amidst the Cold War and the communist frenzy, and in combination with the developments taking place in Cyprus, the Greek population, the Rum population of Istanbul, fell victim to what came to be called the 6-7 September events, a pogrom against the Christian population, with state oppression and discrimination towards minorities to continue during the 60s, despite the liberal atmosphere the new constitution of 1961 brought. For example, in 1962, a provisional commission on minorities was secretly established to track all transactions of minorities contrary to the national security, a catchword during that time, end of quotation, and to serve as the modus operandi of the systematic discriminatory policies. Against this background, the Rum population suffered anew in 1964, again in combination with Cyprus, with the Rum properties being seized and schools and sanctuaries shut down. Now, the approach towards religious minorities in Turkey only began to be questioned in the 1980s as a part of the political transformation process that developed in tandem with the country's opening up to the world. This period was marked by the introduction of various liberal policies and Turkey's application for EU membership, which reached a turning point when Ankara officially gained EU candidate status at the Helsinki summit in 1999. As monitored by the progress reports issued by the European Commission, between 2001 and 2003, Turkey introduced three reform packages enhancing human rights standards in light of the Copenhagen criteria for accession. The transformation process continued when the AKP, a party with roots building on Islamic identity, came to power in 2002 and assured the continuation of the EU accession process. Turkey's reform process indeed continued with the introduction of 5 more reform packages, by the end of 2004, which enabled the establishment of association on the basis of race, ethnicity, religion, sect, region, or any other minority group, the construction of sanctuaries other than mosques, and aimed to address problems with regard to the board election in Christian foundations. These reforms were followed by new legislation, including the law on foundations in 2008 and its amendment in 2011, a period which corresponds to the first 2 terms of the AKP in power. The second term started in 2007, which paved the way for religious communities to reacquire, register, and restore their properties. Furthermore, new regulations were issued in order to handle the issues related to private schools that belong to religious minorities. And in addition to these legal arrangements, a change in the state's approach towards non-Muslim minorities was noticeable. The changes did not remain only at the ideational level, but indeed a dialogue process was initiated between representatives of Christian communities and government authorities. This had positive effects on issues related to the manifestation of religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship, and observance, and resulted in growing support for the AKP among non-Muslim citizens. A look at the Turkish press of the time reveals a considerable number of articles emphasizing this aspect of the AKP's government, also embraced by Christian websites, both in Turkey and abroad, and organizations as well. Still, the transformation progress, regardless of how positive it was, still had its limitations. To date, the non-Muslim communities remain deprived of legal personality. The issue of board elections for foundations, which had been suspended by governmental decree, is still waiting for a solution. Moreover, shortcomings in private school regulations, the existence of a religion section on national identity cards, and the frequent undermining of judicial procedures in the investigations and hearing of cases relating to killings of Christian citizens. I believe the murder of Hrant Dink, the Armenian journalist, and that of the three owners of Christian publishing house in Malatya stand strong, although, has to be mentioned, forced the government to meet with minority representatives and increased sympathy for their demands. These are just few examples of the ongoing restrictive attitude towards the freedom of religion in Turkey. Until 2011, right, it was Turkey's golden age of Europeanization, but since then, a series of events, both domestic and international, the Arab uprisings, the Gezi protests, etc., but with domestic impact, signaled a shift also towards non-Muslims in general and Christians in particular. Against this background, what one observes from 2011 onwards is an emphasis on Islamic values that overshadows the equality and richness discourse. This implies that the real motive of the government behind the recasting of religious freedom in Turkey, instead of referring to religious freedom on the basis of equality and human rights, AKP aims to provide a different approach to freedom of religion. Some refer to this as the Turkish or even Ottoman model. Now, although there was an attempt to change not only the discourses and practices, but also the legal status of the non-Muslims and make them first-class and equal citizens, international developments, including and perhaps more importantly, the absence of references to EU norms, the Turkish government seems to be reshaping this equality and richness discourse by putting the religious identity of the party and its constituencies forward. Now, through what has been coined as Yeni Türkiye, New Turkey, the AKP constructs, I believe, an alternative definition of Turkishness and the nation that imagines Turkey not as a nation embattled within its respect with its present political borders, but as a flexibly bounded Turkey that is the self-confident successor to the Ottomans in a rediscovered and reinvented past. In other words, the new Turkish identity consists of devout Muslim Turks, Sunni Muslim Turks, whose subjectivity and vision for the future is shaped by an imperial Ottoman past overlaid onto a republican state framework, but divorced from the Kemalist past state project. Now, with the attempted coup attempt in July 2016, Erdogan and his government accelerated their authoritarian character, already evident since the early 2010s, and adopted a much stronger and tough nationalist discourse to explicitly demonize and even criminalize his critics, like the Gülen movement, of course, for good reason, that was behind the coup attempt. As all authoritarian and dictatorial regimes, the AKP in particular, Erdogan resorted to conspiracy theories, capitalizing on the Turks suffering from Sevr syndrome, what we talked about with Dr. Stavroulakakis during lunch, by claiming that the EU, the US, and the West in general were attempting to destroy Turkey by using their traitor puppets in Turkey, such as the Alevis, Gülenis, and Kurds. The insistence on turning the identically named Hagia Sophia museums in Istanbul and Trabzon into mosques, I believe shows, among other things, of course, the AKP's perception of Christians as well, and that Christians are considered as well as traitors, performing within Turkey itself. These structures were Christian sanctuaries for centuries. They were converted into mosques following the Ottoman conquest, and then eventually became museums during the Republican era. The image of AKP as an imaginary Ottoman authority, prioritizing Islam over Christianity, was further advanced with the reopening of the Hagia Sophia Museum in Trabzon as a mosque in 2013, and of course, more recently, with the reconversion of Hagia Sophia in Istanbul into a mosque in 2020, sharpening an already tense ideological divide between not only pious and secular Turks, but also between Muslims and Christians worldwide. The AKP, which has been in power in Turkey since 2002, announced the mosque's opening with nationalist, archaic, and harsh rhetoric that described the conversion using terms such as right of conquest. It was a shocking move for non-Muslim and secular components of Turkey alike, as well as a dramatic disappointment for some groups that still hold out hope for Turkey's AKP, which ostensibly rules Turkey independently, but in reality is intertwined with various circles of state and societal power. While the conversion of Hagia Sophia was the subject of a great debate centered on the topic of world cultural heritage, it is also part of a discussion that extends to the clash of civilization. If we take notice on Erdogan's rhetoric, it is Huntingtonian 100%. However, the gravity of the event and the increasing ethno-religious authoritarianism of the AKP has stymied this debate. Unfortunately, it is not the first time that a place of worship with the status of a museum or an active place of worship has been changed into a mosque during the AKP's rule. The transformation of Armenian, Syriac, and Orthodox Christian churches, either moribund or in active use, into mosques that are then placed under the auspices of the Diyanet, the Directorate of Religious Affairs, has been a common occurrence during the AKP period. Undoubtedly, this practice is an indication of the relevance that Islam has achieved during the AKP's rule, both as an instrument and as an objective. In conclusion, Recep Tayyip Erdogan's Turkish government, over the course of the last 22 years, has demonstrated, 20 years, has demonstrated a mixed track record with regard to religious minorities, characterized both by gestures of benevolence as well as a gregarious scapegoating and persecution of the same groups. This has been especially true in the aftermath of the coup attempt in 2016. What appears to be, I believe, to be inconsistencies in the Turkish government's rhetoric and policy toward minorities are in fact various modalities of a coherent neo-Islamist strategy of instrumentalizing minorities. Erdogan has used this strategy to consolidate power at home and to pursue foreign policy goals abroad. Although the AKP is still trying to convince the world and the Turkish people of its democratic and pluralistic phase, behind the scenes and lately more openly, Erdogan has been building a majoritarian and authoritarian regime, pursuing social engineering and pivoting Turkey from the transatlantic alliance and its values. Taken at face value, the AKP's rule, while in power, offers a bewildering array of contradictory discourses and practices, ranging from ostensibly warm embraces of minorities to the vilest smears and hate speech. Making sense of the apparent contradictions in the Erdogan's government's policy and discourse towards minorities requires situating them in their respective contexts, as well as mapping the domestic and global parameters that shape them. What appears to be contradictory at first glance fits into an overall neo-Islamist game plan that reinforces sectarian hierarchies, institutionalizes discrimination, transforms rights into discretionary benevolent acts, and solidifies majoritarian hegemony. A holistic and contextualized look at the AKP's rhetoric and policy, I believe, reveals the following four modalities, which I will briefly mention. First, scapegoating of and incitement against minorities to mobilize the electorate, solidify the ranks of loyalists, and strengthen majoritarian hegemony at home. Second, propagating conspiracy theories about minorities to divert the Turkish public's attention from the government's policy failures. Third, performing acts of neo-Ottoman benevolence to portray the regime and its leadership as tolerant at home and abroad, while also highlighting and reinforcing sectarian hierarchies between the ruling majority and the subject minorities. And lastly, implementing policies ranging from benevolent to nefarious toward minorities to ensure favorable treatment or to extract concessions in international relations. Now, if during the early Republican and later years, Turkishness was defined as those who are part of the Turkish ethnic identity, during the AKP years, Turkishness came to mean those who are part of the Turkish Sunni Muslim ethnic identity. Needless to say, Christians as minorities in general present a threat, real or imagined, to the AKP's vision of Turkish nation. Thank you very much for your attention.